Still, when the entire office had already gone back to pretending not to watch, a millionaire stood in the middle of an empty corporate lobby holding an expensive glass of champagne from his own company's anniversary party, laughing at the sight of an old, battered guitar case propped against a mop bucket near the service elevator. He did not know yet that the man who owned that guitar was standing directly behind him, close enough to hear every word. The millionaire's name was Desmond Hale, the founder and majority shareholder of Hale Dynamics, a commercial real estate firm that had grown, over 18 years, into one of the largest property management companies in the state. He had built the company from a single leased office to a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and he had built, along with it, a reputation for a particular kind of blunt, unfiltered arrogance that his employees had long since learned to simply endure rather than confront. That evening, the company was celebrating its 18th anniversary, and the building's ground floor lobby had been rented out for a lavish party, string lights, catering, a jazz trio hired for the evening. Desmond, several drinks in, had wandered toward the service corridor near the elevators, more out of restless boredom than any real purpose, when he spotted the guitar case, faded and taped along one seam, sitting beside a janitor's cart. "Somebody's optimistic," he said loudly, to no one in particular, gesturing at the case with his champagne glass, loud enough for the small cluster of employees nearby to hear. "A guitar that old belongs in a dumpster, not a building I own. I'd bet good money whoever owns that thing can't play 3 notes without breaking a string." Before we go any further, if you believe that talent does not announce itself through appearances and that the people easiest to overlook are so often the ones carrying something extraordinary inside them, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder to look twice before making up their mind about a person. Now, back to the story. The man who owned the guitar was standing 6 feet behind Desmond, having just returned from emptying a trash bin down the hallway. His name was Eugene Marsh, and he had worked as part of the building's overnight custodial staff for 11 years. He was 61 years old, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself during his shifts, well liked by the handful of employees who worked late enough to cross paths with him, though most of Hale Dynamics' staff, including Desmond himself, had never exchanged more than a passing nod with him in over a decade. What none of them knew, because Eugene had never once mentioned it during 11 years of emptying their trash bins and vacuuming their conference rooms, was that before he had ever picked up a mop, Eugene Marsh had spent nearly 2 decades as a session guitarist, playing behind some of the most respected names in blues and soul music during the genre's later golden years, touring small clubs and modest venues across the country, never quite famous himself, but deeply respected within a circle of musicians who understood exactly how rare his particular touch on a guitar neck really was. He had stopped touring in his 40s after his wife's illness required him to be home consistently, taking whatever steady work he could find that let him be present for her care in a way the touring life never could. After she passed, he had simply never returned to that world, not out of bitterness, but because the version of himself that used to live inside music felt, for many years afterward, too painful to visit. He kept the guitar because he could not bring himself to sell it. He brought it to work most evenings, because his small apartment, since a recent lease dispute, had become unreliable to leave valuables in unattended. And he found, without ever quite admitting it to himself, a strange comfort in simply having it nearby during his shifts, propped against his cart like an old friend keeping him company through the quiet hours. Eugene had heard every word Desmond said. He did not respond right away. He had spent 11 years learning exactly how invisible a uniform and a mop could make a person in a building full of people who had never once asked him a question about his life beyond whether the restrooms had been restocked. He was accustomed to being overlooked. What he was not accustomed to, what made something in his chest tighten in a way it had not in years, was hearing his guitar itself mocked. The one physical object that still connected him to a version of himself he had quietly grieved for a very long time. One of the younger employees standing nearby, a junior associate named Priya, who had always made a point of greeting Eugene by name during her late nights at the office, spoke up before Eugene had decided whether to say anything at all. "That's Eugene's guitar," she said, her voice carrying an edge of discomfort at what her boss had just said in front of the man himself, who was now clearly visible standing just a few feet away. "He's right there, actually." Desmond turned, and for a brief moment, something like embarrassment flickered across his face before his usual bravado reasserted itself. The particular defensive bravado of a man unaccustomed to being caught saying something unkind. Rather than apologizing, he doubled down, the way people sometimes do when caught off guard in front of an audience. "No offense," he said to Eugene, though his tone suggested he expected none to be taken. "I just call it like I see it. That guitar's seen better decades. You actually play that thing, or is it just for decoration?" Eugene looked at him for a long moment, calm in a way that unsettled several onlookers more than any anger would have. "I play it," he said simply. "Prove it," Desmond said, half laughing, gesturing toward the small stage where the hired jazz trio had just finished their set and was taking a break. "Go on, play something. If you're actually any good, I'll believe you. If not, well, I said what I said." Before we continue, we want a pause here. Because what happened next did not happen because Eugene needed Desmond's approval, or because he particularly cared what a man who had never once learned his last name thought of him. It happened because something in Eugene, some quiet, patient part of himself that had been dormant for nearly 2 decades, decided in that moment that it was finally time to stop being invisible on someone else's terms. He set down his cart. He opened the case, the worn latches clicking with a familiarity that only came from thousands of repetitions over decades. He lifted the guitar, an old hollow-body instrument with a finish worn thin in exactly the places a hand rests during long hours of playing, and walked, without hurry, toward the small stage where the jazz trio's abandoned microphone still stood. The room, which had continued its low murmur of party conversation throughout the exchange, went quiet the moment Eugene struck the first chord. It was not simply that he was good. Priya, who had grown up around musicians through her father's own amateur band, would later describe it as one of those rare moments where a room full of strangers all realize, at the exact same instant, that they are witnessing something far beyond what the circumstances led them to expect. Eugene played a slow, aching blues progression, his fingers moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had spent decades not performing for approval, but simply living inside the music itself. He did not look at Desmond. He did not look at anyone. He closed his eyes, and for nearly 4 minutes, the 18th anniversary party of Hale Dynamics fell completely silent, except for the sound of a 61-year-old janitor playing a beaten guitar with a mastery that made 2 members of the actual hired jazz trio walk back into the room just to listen, both of them, by the end, exchanging a look that clearly communicated they had just witnessed something they themselves could not replicate. When Eugene finished, letting the final note ring out and fade into silence, nobody applauded right away. The silence held for a long moment, the particular silence of a room recalibrating its entire understanding of a person in real time. Then Priya began clapping, and within seconds the entire lobby had erupted, some employees visibly emotional, the jazz trio's band leader crossing the room to shake Eugene's hand and ask, with genuine urgency, where in the world he had learned to play like that. Desmond Hale stood frozen through all of it, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand, his earlier bravado completely evaporated, replaced by something that looked, to those watching closely, almost like shame. He approached Eugene once the applause had settled, and for the first time in 11 years of sharing a building with him, actually asked him a real question, not about restrooms or trash schedules, but about who he was. Eugene, still calm, still unhurried, told him. He told him about the touring years, about the musicians he had played alongside, whose names Desmond, despite considering himself reasonably cultured, recognized with visible surprise. He told him about his late wife, about the years of care that had ended his touring life, about the small apartment and the lease dispute that had made him start bringing his guitar to work in the first place. Desmond listened, and something in his expression shifted over the course of that conversation, from embarrassment into something closer to genuine, uncomfortable self-reflection. He asked Eugene, finally, why he had never mentioned any of it in 11 years of working in the same building. "Nobody ever asked," Eugene said, without bitterness, simply stating a fact. Before we go further, we want to acknowledge the people who had quietly recognized Eugene's worth long before that night. Because Desmond was far from the first to overlook him, and Priya was far from the only one who had chosen otherwise. A former bandmate named Curtis, who had toured alongside Eugene decades earlier and had gone on to modest fame of his own, had never stopped calling him every few months just to check in, still believing, even after all these years, that Eugene's talent deserved a wider audience than one late-night phone call could offer. A neighbor named Dolores, who lived down the hall from Eugene's apartment, often left her door open on evenings when she heard him practicing quietly through the thin walls, telling anyone who would listen that the sounds coming from apartment 4C were the finest free concert in the building. None of them were in that lobby that night. All of them were. In the weeks that followed, Desmond Hale did something none of his employees expected from a man known primarily for blunt dismissiveness. He did not simply apologize privately and move on, the way many people in his position might have chosen to. He asked Eugene, with genuine humility, whether he would be willing to perform at the company's next major event. Not as a novelty, not as an amusing story to tell, but as the featured musical guest, properly paid, properly credited, properly respected. Eugene, cautious after decades of quiet invisibility, took several days to consider it before agreeing. The performance, 3 months later, at Hale Dynamics' Spring Gala, drew a reaction that surprised even Desmond, who by then had come to genuinely respect the man he had once mocked in front of a room full of strangers. Eugene played for nearly 40 minutes, and by the end, several attendees, including a talent scout who happened to be the spouse of one of the company's board members, approached him with real, concrete interest in helping him record an album, something Eugene had quietly stopped believing was still possible for a man his age who had spent the last decade emptying trash bins rather than playing stages. Desmond funded the recording himself, quietly, without ever making it public knowledge within the company, because he had come to understand, in the months since that anniversary party, that the gesture meant more as a private correction than a public relations opportunity. The album, released the following year under Eugene's own name for the first time in over 2 decades, drew modest but genuine critical attention. Several reviewers noting with something like wonder that Eugene Marsh's playing had somehow grown even more emotionally resonant in the decades since he had last recorded, as though every unheard year had been quietly folded into every note. Eugene did not quit his job at Hale Dynamics, despite Desmond's insistence that he no longer needed to. He told Desmond, with the same calm directness that had first unsettled him months earlier, that the job had given him stability during the hardest years of his life, that he had no interest in abandoning that steadiness entirely, and that he intended to keep working there, on his own terms, for as long as it suited him. Desmond, who had spent 18 years building a company around the belief that success meant accumulating more, found himself deeply humbled by a man who had decided that enough, on his own terms, was a perfectly complete way to live. Their relationship shifted permanently after that. Desmond began stopping by Eugene's overnight rounds occasionally, not to check on his work, but simply to talk, the two of them developing an unlikely friendship built on Desmond's slow, genuine effort to become the kind of person who asked questions before making assumptions. Priya, promoted within the year, partly on the strength of the quiet courage she had shown speaking up that night, often joined them, the three of them forming an odd but genuine bond that none of them could have predicted the night Desmond mocked an old guitar case sitting beside a mop bucket. On the 1-year anniversary of that party, Hale Dynamics held its next annual celebration, and this time, Eugene was not an accidental performer discovered by mistake, but the guest of honor, introduced by Desmond himself, who stood in front of the entire company and told the story publicly for the first time, including his own role in it, without softening the parts that made him look foolish or unkind. He told the room that the biggest mistake he had made in 18 years of running the company was assuming that a person's value could be measured by the uniform they wore or the condition of the case they carried, and that the greatest correction of his professional life had come not from a business decision, but from 4 minutes of music he almost walked away from without ever hearing. In the months following the album's release, Eugene's story spread quietly through the small, tight-knit community of session musicians and blues enthusiasts who still remembered his name from decades earlier. Curtis, the former bandmate who had never stopped calling him, flew in for the album release, and the two men, now both in their 60s, spent an entire evening reminiscing about tour buses and small clubs and the particular exhaustion of a life spent chasing music from town to town. Curtis told a local music journalist during an interview about the album that Eugene had always been the most naturally gifted player in their old circle, and that losing him to circumstance rather than lack of talent had always felt, to those who remembered him, like one of the genuine tragedies of their generation's music scene. Dolores, the neighbor who had spent years listening to Eugene's quiet practice sessions through the thin apartment walls, was invited to the album's small release gathering, and she cried through most of Eugene's set, telling him afterward that she had always believed the whole building was lucky to have him, even if nobody else seemed to notice. Priya's role in the story did not end with her promotion. She and Eugene developed a genuine friendship over the following year, and she often credited him, in later conversations with colleagues, as the reason she had learned to trust her own instincts rather than simply going along with whatever her superiors said, even when speaking up felt uncomfortable. She kept a framed photograph on her desk from the night of the anniversary party, a candid shot someone had taken of Eugene mid-performance, guitar in hand, eyes closed, the exact moment the room had gone silent, as a permanent reminder of what could happen when someone chose to say something rather than stay quiet. Desmond's transformation extended beyond his relationship with Eugene alone. Employees at Hale Dynamics began noticing gradually that their notoriously blunt founder had started asking more questions before making judgments, had started in meetings, deferring more often to the people who actually did the daily work, rather than assuming his own read of a situation was automatically correct. He never became a dramatically different person overnight, and those who knew him well noted that his old bluntness never fully disappeared, but something in how he wielded it had softened, tempered by the memory of 4 minutes of guitar playing that had quietly rearranged his entire understanding of what he did and did not actually know about the people around him. He established within the year a small internal program at Hale Dynamics, specifically designed to surface hidden skills and interests among staff who might never otherwise have the opportunity to be recognized for anything beyond their job title, a modest but genuine initiative that several employees later credited with changing how they viewed their own place within the company. It was, several people noted, a strange and fitting legacy for a mistake that had started with a mocking comment about an old guitar case beside a mop bucket. Eugene, for his part, continued working his overnight shifts for another 2 years before finally retiring. Not because he needed to stop, but because he decided, at 63, that it was finally time to spend his evenings the way he wanted to, rather than the way circumstance had required for so long. His retirement party, held in the same lobby where the entire story had begun, drew a crowd far larger than any company event Hale Dynamics had hosted before, employees from every department wanting to be there for the man who had, without ever intending to, taught an entire company something about the danger of assuming you already know a person's whole story. There was a detail from that original anniversary night that few people beyond Priya and Eugene ever fully learned. In the immediate silence right after Eugene finished his first song, before the applause began, Desmond had leaned toward Priya and quietly asked her, his voice uncharacteristically unsteady, whether she thought Eugene had heard everything he said before walking up to the stage. Priya had told him the truth, that yes, Eugene had almost certainly heard every word. Desmond later told her that in that brief silence, waiting to see whether Eugene would even acknowledge him, he had felt something close to the specific dread of realizing, all at once, that he had built an entire evening's worth of casual cruelty on an assumption that had taken exactly 4 minutes to be proven catastrophically wrong. Eugene's daughter, Renee, who lived several states away and had grown up watching her father slowly retreat from the music world after her mother's illness, flew in for the album release without telling him in advance, wanting to surprise him. She had grown up hearing stories from her mother about her father's touring years, stories that had always felt, to her, like relics of a life he had permanently set aside. Watching him perform again, watching a room of strangers respond to his playing with the same reverence her mother used to describe from decades earlier, she later told a family friend that it was the first time in over 15 years she had seen her father look, even briefly, like the version of himself that existed before grief had quieted so much of him. Never underestimate a person because of the container their talent happens to be carried in. Never assume that a worn case holds nothing worth hearing. Never mistake quiet invisibility for having nothing to say. And never forget that the people easiest to overlook are so often carrying entire lifetimes of skill and beauty that nobody ever thought to ask about. And never forget that sometimes the most valuable lesson a person can learn arrives not from a mentor or a book, but from a 61-year-old janitor who finally decided, after 11 years of silence, that it was time to be heard. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment about which part touched you most, and share it with someone who needs a reminder to look twice before deciding what someone is or isn't capable of. Subscribe for more stories about hidden talent, humility, and the quiet people who end up teaching us the most important lessons of our lives. Because sometimes the person mopping the floor at midnight has spent decades carrying more artistry inside them than the person signing their paycheck ever imagined possible.